So I want to talk about the suburbs versus cities issue here because it's an issue that comes up a lot in online discourse. And it's a very contentious issue lately because I think a lot of people think, whether correctly or incorrectly, that urbanists are threatening our suburbs. They're trying to take it away from us. And conversely, a lot of urbanists think, well, suburbanites are threatening, like suburbanists, they are threatening our way of life and trying to take it away from us. And I think both sides kind of have a point there. Like, yes, both sides are threatening the other and trying to take their way of life away from them to some extent. And I think that is the nature of all conflict, whether it be race, nation, religion, gender, whatever. Ultimately, there's always give or take. One side wins at the expense of the other side losing. True harmony is simply impossible. You can have a stalemate to some extent, but you can never have true harmony. One side always wins at the expense of another. And I know I've talked about suburbia and this issue a lot in my previous videos, but I think there's some points that I need to make here that I haven't really outlined fully. So there's basically two issues that I want to tackle here. The first is, what are the pros and cons of urban versus suburban areas? And the second is, how exactly do suburbs hurt the cities? Why can't they simply coexist? So in looking at the pros and cons, I think it's pretty obvious. Urbanists and urbanites typically say the main benefits of walkable urban areas. And by the way, when I'm talking about urban areas, I'm really talking about walkable urban areas, which means like a certain minimum threshold of density. So like medium or high density, and also with a heavy amount of public transit. What I'm not talking about is like certain cities, like say Oklahoma City or Kansas City or Albuquerque or what have you, that have essentially downtown areas that aren't even that dense and that don't really even meet the threshold for walkability. They might have like light rail systems that hardly anyone uses, but they're not really like dense cities in the true sense of the word. So I'm not really talking about cities like that. What I'm talking about is more cities like New York, Philadelphia, DC, Boston, Toronto, Montreal, Paris, London, etc. Like denser, more walkable type cities. And when I'm talking about suburbs, I'm talking about like your typical standard North American low density car dependent single family home zone suburb. I'm not talking about European style suburbs, which are often like apartment buildings and often have a density level that's much higher than North American suburbs, and often do have a significant amount of public transit, although they are more car dependent than the inner cities in Europe, but still with a good amount of public transit. More car centric, at least, I'll say that, because they often do have wide roads like American suburbs, like wide major roads, but they still do have a lot more public transit than your standard low density North American suburb. Now, I understand that Europe does have suburbs like North American suburbs. Like there are low density suburbs in Europe also. So insofar as this video is relevant to Europe, and it's really not, like it's really more North America centric, and I suppose Australia and New Zealand also, because they have a very similar dynamic and similar discourse going on there. But like insofar as it applies to Europe, it would mostly apply to those types of suburbs, which are often the exception and not the norm, although it can vary from one city to the other. But yes, there are North American style suburbs in Europe. They do exist. They don't look exactly the same. The style of architecture is a bit different. The layout's a bit different. The streets don't tend to be quite as wide. But yes, Europe does have suburbs that are predominantly single family home and car centric. It's just, I would say they're not as aggressively car centric as North American suburbs, but they do exist. So like, yes, this discussion is relevant to Europe also, but it's predominantly a discussion in a North American and Australian, New Zealand context. So it's mostly New World centric, but partially applicable to Europe also. So now that I've got it out of the way, what I'm talking about, okay. When looking at urban versus suburban areas, oh, by the way, I should also mention in Canada and also in the United States, there are some suburbs that don't fully apply to this discussion because you have some suburbs that are like partly dense or a mix of densities where you have a lot of like apartment buildings and stuff like that. I'm not really talking so much about those types of suburbs, which are like moderately common in Canada and less common in the United States, although they do exist in some places in the US, like Washington, D.C., for instance. But I'm not really talking as much about those types of suburbs. I am more talking about your standard, like low density single family home suburbs, which do exist also in Canada. I'd say in Canada, it's probably about like 70% of our suburbs are like that, and 30% are more like the mixed type suburbs that I'm talking about, like mixed density. So I'm more talking about like the 70% of Canadian suburbs that are like predominantly single family home. And in the United States, it would be probably more like 90%. That's the types of suburbs I'm talking about. Again, I'm pulling these numbers out of my ass. I don't know what the actual percentage is. You'd have to do a very detailed study to find that out. And then you'd have to measure a lot of different metrics, including population density, but not just population density. But yeah, I am predominantly talking about, in the context of suburbs, the low density type. So that out of the way, okay, what are the pros and cons of suburbs versus urban areas? Well, for dense walkable urban areas, the main qualities which are often touted by urbanists, is that you don't need to own a car. You can get around without a car. You get a lot more exercise because you're walking a lot more. There's more of a sense of community. There's more of a sense of culture. I would say a lot of these are heavily dependent on the type of city you're in. But by and large, these are considered the benefits of a walkable urban community. Now, getting into more detail a little bit about this, the reason why walking is a benefit is that it is proven that places where people walk more have lower obesity rates. This is well documented. They also do live longer on average. So there are very real and highly documented health effects of living in walkable urban areas. And this is even in spite of these areas having a bit higher air pollution on average because of the density. But it seems that overall, in terms of health, the positive impact of more walking makes up for the negative impact of perhaps slightly to moderately more air pollution. So, and again, air pollution, when I'm talking about air pollution, okay, another benefit is lower carbon emissions. But okay, let me explain, because this part always confuses people. It confused me even for a long time. How is it that urban areas have more air pollution but lower carbon emissions per capita? That's because air pollution is simply the amount of pollution in the air in a given area. Whereas per capita carbon emissions has to do with each person and how much carbon they're emitting. So when you have people that are more spread out, there's going to be less pollution in the immediate area, but more pollution potentially per person. It's just that when the people are more spread out, there's less pollution in the air in your area, but yet each person individually is actually polluting more. Does that make sense? Also, there's the fact that carbon emissions and air pollution aren't necessarily one and the same. Carbon emissions contribute to air pollution, but other things that don't emit carbon also contribute to air pollution. So they're not entirely one and the same. Like, carbon emissions is specifically linked to global warming, whereas air pollution in a broader sense may or may not, depending on what type of pollution it is, be linked to global warming. That is the scientific consensus. I don't entirely understand every detail of it, but that is the science of it. So that is how, for instance, a dense inner city can have more air pollution like the air is more polluted than in the suburbs, but the suburbs, each individual person contributes more per capita to carbon emissions than the people living in the cities. I hope that makes sense. I hope I've explained that properly. So that being said, yeah, that's another benefit of living in urban areas, is that you are personally contributing less to carbon emissions per capita overall. So yeah, going into that in more detail, not needing a car is also beneficial because, okay, it saves you money from avoiding the expenses of car ownership, but there's also the fact that you're contributing less to carbon emissions. As mentioned, it's one of the main factors that urbanites drive less, and thus either they don't drive at all or they drive less in an average day, week, month, or even your year. So, I mean, there's that, but there's also the fact that they are at reduced risk for dying or being injured in a car accident, which is one of the main premature causes of death in North America. I think it's one of the highest, definitely twice as high as homicide, more or less, and everybody freaks out about being murdered. So there's that you're way less likely to die in a car accident if you live in an urban area, and especially if you're not driving regularly, because that's the thing. From what I've seen statistically, suburbanites do die more from from automobile related, like from car crashes per capita than urbanites. But that number is, like, from the statistics I've seen, the problem with these statistics is that they look at all urban areas in the United States, including the ones like Oklahoma City or whatever that aren't really true walkable cities. So I think if they look specifically at walkable cities, the discrepancy would be even greater. Because from the numbers I've seen, yes, suburbanites do die at a higher per capita rate from car accidents, but the difference overall isn't that great, like, compared to urbanites. However, if you only looked at, like, specifically like dense walkable cities, I think the discrepancy would be even greater. And it would be even greater still if you only look at people who live in those dense walkable cities but make the choice to take transit as opposed to driving. So there's that. There's that benefit. More community and culture is a big one, because I do feel like urban dense areas, they have more independent restaurants, they have more museums, they have more historic architecture, although that is something that is not constant in every city. Some cities obviously have a lot more historic architecture than others, but the number of, like, low density suburbs that have great historic architecture is essentially zero. Like, low density suburbs by nature are post World War II. I suppose there's some exceptional ones like Rosedale, which are pre-World War II and have some nice architecture. But again, Rosedale is technically in the city. Like, that's a neighborhood in Toronto. So again, is Rosedale a true suburb? Not really. Like, are there any areas that are pre-World War II that are considered true suburbs by suburbanites? I don't know. Because a lot of those areas are technically within city limits and technically do have some urban traits also, and often have a mix of different densities. Like Rosedale, even despite being a very wealthy area, does have some high density housing, including apartment buildings and also like townhouses, semi-detached, or like close together dense detached homes. So even Rosedale may not meet the definition of a true suburb from the suburbanist, like, low density single family home from that perspective. So yes, historic architecture would be something that cities have more often. But again, you could make the point, but if you live in a modern city, you don't benefit from that. And I would agree, actually, that, like, modern cities aren't nearly as great as historic ones, and one of the biggest benefits of living in a city is having access to historic architecture. And if you don't live in a city that has historic architecture, then one of the biggest benefits to city living is just gone out the window right there. So I'll agree with that. on the suburbanist side. But yeah, so I would say, yeah, as I was saying, the biggest benefits to living in a density, environmental, like lower carbon emissions, that you don't have to drive, which saves money and also reduces your chances of being killed or injured in a car accident. Uh, and also lower obesity rates and lower rates of the negative health effects associated with obesity. Um, More community, more culture, more of a sense of there being like there's more independent restaurants. There's a higher chance, like some cities have historic architecture, whereas in suburbs like none do, basically, more or less, aside from a few very specific isolated places. But yeah, by and large, cities are better in that regard, like just culturally for things like museums, symphony halls, opera houses, etc. Just the cultural opportunities, the attractions are much more immense, generally speaking, in cities. So those are some of the main benefits. Also, what could be a pro or a con is the having a reduced living space. That could be a pro for some people. It could be a feature rather than a bug, because for some people, like taking care of a huge property is a massive expense and a massive pain in the ass that they don't want. So that could be a pro or a con. Now, conversely, the cons of city living, dense city living, or any city to some extent, like some of these would apply just to dense cities, but some would also apply to like your Oklahoma cities, your Kansas cities, like your less dense inner cities also. Higher crime rates. It is true. Cities, as a rule, do tend to have higher crime rates. I think that has more to do with the inner city rather than the density itself, because the less dense cities are often some of the worst, like ones like Memphis, Detroit, Albuquerque. Like a lot of these ones are actually worse than like the denser walkable cities. But overall, yes, there does seem to be a strong correlation between larger cities and higher crime rates. And even like cities versus suburbs within the same metropolitan area. I've searched and searched. I haven't been able to find a single metropolitan area where it seems the suburbs overall have a worse crime rate than the cities. I could, at least in a North American context. I could be wrong. Actually, wait, that's not true. Charleston, South Carolina. The suburbs do have a worse crime rate than the city. As I've said in past videos, that city is the exception on many trends, including racial demographics. The inner city is whiter significantly than the suburbs in Charleston. But yeah, my point is, as a whole, like, yes, there are some crime-ridden suburbs, and it's an increasing issue with suburbs like, say, Ferguson, Missouri, where the Michael Brown incident and the related riots happened. Crime-ridden suburbs are becoming increasingly common. Compton is one of the earlier examples. Compton, California. I mean, it is a low-density single-family home neighborhood, even if it is, well, it's not really low density. I might call it even medium density, but it is single-family homes, and it is kind of car-centric. So I would say it sort of meets the definition of a suburb. That's more arguable, but like Ferguson, Missouri definitely does. As do many places in Prince George's County, Maryland. Now, many of these crime-ridden suburbs are predominantly black or predominantly Hispanic or a mix of both, but they do exist, and many suburbanites will deny it till they're blue in the face, but no, these places do exist. They have become increasingly common over the last few decades. Definitely the actions of the Obama administration played a role there, because I think there was a desire to get more diversity into the suburbs specifically, and I think in some cases they did succeed. So the idea of this like uniformity, like with the film 8 Mile, like the city is black, the suburbs are white, the city is poor, the suburbs are rich. This uniformity does not exist anymore, and even in the case of 8 Mile itself, it does not exist anymore. Many of the suburbs on the suburban side of 8 Mile are now predominantly black, like Southfield, Michigan, and they do have crime issues as well. So this stark night and day contrast between the city and suburbs does not exist to the same extent it used to. And a lot of people in debates, they act like it does. It doesn't. We're not in the 1990s anymore. We're not in the 1980s anymore. Things have changed, but I will concede overall, as a general rule, in terms of the general averages, yes, the cities do still have a higher crime rate than the suburbs. And also, even more so specifically when it comes to homelessness and crimes that are specifically associated with homelessness, absolutely, homelessness is far more ubiquitous in inner cities and dense neighborhoods. That being said, not all types of crimes revolve around homelessness. Not all crimes are committed by the homeless. Growing up, where I grew up, homelessness was not an issue, but gang crime definitely was an issue. And I can tell you straight up, gang members can be scarier than homeless people. Like, I would honestly take, if I was to walk down a dark alley and it was either homeless or gangbangers, I would choose the homeless over the gangbangers as the people who I walk by in the dark alley. Okay? Um, these days, homelessness seems to be the big thing. Like, everybody's talking about homelessness and homeless crime, and the homeless population absolutely has exploded. But I'm just saying it's not the only type of crime to be concerned about. And yes, homelessness is affecting some suburbs. I have seen it. Like, I saw homeless people in Aurora, Colorado, which is a suburb of Denver. So like, it's not as big an issue in the suburbs as in the inner city, but it is starting to spread into some suburbs also, although not to as much of an extent. But yes, I would say actually gangbanger type crime is spreading into the suburbs more so than homeless crime overall. And has been spreading for a while, but both are to some extent. But I will concede overall crime is worse in the cities. But it does vary from city to city and from suburb to suburb, and the worst suburbs in terms of crime are worse than the best inner city neighborhoods for sure. It's not even a competition. Like, there's plenty of overlap where the worst suburbs are worse in terms of crime rate than the best dense urban neighborhoods. Um but yes, crime overall, I'll concede that is a negative about the cities. Um Another negative about the cities is, okay, from a certain perspective, you could say they have less space, which could be a positive or a negative. But yeah, if you're raising kids, often having more space can be considered beneficial to an extent. Although even then, I think having too much space can be a burden when you're requiring like a housemaid or whatever. That's a big expense. Less privacy, I will concede that. Like, urban areas, as a rule, have less privacy. You feel it everywhere. You feel it at home. You feel it when you go out. There is less of a sense of privacy. Um, that being said, there are certain mitigating factors, like the construction of walls is a big thing. Like, if you have proper soundproofing, you can mitigate that somewhat even in dense urban neighborhoods. Furthermore, it is possible to have dense neighborhoods with detached homes. It's just that the homes have to be close together and they can't be too big in terms of their footprint. If you want more square footage, you got to build up. You can't build out. And giant big yards are out of the question. Like, you can't have a full-size swimming pool. You could have maybe one of those small little above ground pools, but yeah, a full-size swimming pool is out of the question. So, yeah, there's certain sacrifices you need to make, but you can theoretically still have detached homes in dense urban neighborhoods, and there are homes like that in plenty of the older parts of Toronto, for instance, Chicago, St. Louis, like plenty, Charleston, South Carolina. These New Orleans, like, these types of homes do exist in historic neighborhoods. It's just they're seldomly built today, except when they tear down a historic home and build another house in its place that's of a similar size, which is a common practice in Toronto and Chicago, for instance. But it's true that they don't build these as much anymore in new neighborhoods, which is a shame because I think these types of homes, there's many benefits to them. These dense detached homes. But yeah, I'll concede that. Overall in cities, there's less privacy, but as I said, I think it can be mitigated to some extent. by the type of house being constructed, or even in like apartment and townhouses, um, better soundproofing. And there needs to also be more transparency in um, like there needs to be some kind of standardized system where you know what you're getting into when you're buying or renting a place regarding the soundproofing. And that is something where the laws currently are very inadequate in informing people about the soundproofing of places that they're moving into. But yeah, overall, okay, so crime, space, which could be a pro or con, and privacy. Also, which goes hand in hand with all of these factors, is noise. Dense cities are louder on average, and it can impact your sleep negatively. Although, for some reason, people in the Netherlands, of all places, get more sleep on average than in any other country, apparently, including the United States. So I don't know. Maybe it's not the only factor in sleep, because granted, okay, there are some things about the suburbs that might make you get less sleep. For instance, even if it's quieter, you're spending more time on home maintenance, like mowing the lawn and all that shit, shoveling snow, raking leaves, vacuuming, and that probably cuts into your sleep time because you're spending so much time doing that shit. Having obesity-related health issues can cut into your sleep time because it makes it harder to sleep if you're unhealthy. Um, I mean, and furthermore, there's certain factors where it's like if you have a baby in your house, it's going to be a problem sleeping regardless of how big the house is. Um, but yeah, I mean, and it should be because you should have the baby monitor and everything. Yeah, by having a baby, you're basically inherently sacrificing sleep to some extent, unless you have like a full-time live-in nanny. Um, but yeah, which is expensive, obviously. But yeah, like fair enough. Noise issues are a concern in urban areas, and all things considered, urban areas are louder. And again, some people might like a certain amount of noise during the day because they like the vibrancy, the unironic vibrancy and like lively nature of it. But I don't think anybody likes noise when they're trying to sleep. That's the thing. People might like noise when they're going out, when they're doing stuff, when they're having fun. Nobody likes noise when they're trying to sleep. So yeah, I will concede those are kind of the pros and cons of living in an urban area versus a suburban area. Also, not needing a car, it's the flip side of not needing a car is that urban areas are less car friendly. So I guess if you're somebody who really likes driving, that would be a con of living in an urban area. But again, I would say overall, like, I mean, the statistics don't lie. Like, there are many negative consequences of car dependence. I guess you could make the argument that like it could be good to have a car but not rely on it all the time, but have a car for certain instances like grocery shopping or buying like certain large things. I mean, there is the option of delivery services, so I don't know. I don't know how it. Although delivery services for groceries, I find they fuck it up all the time. That's the problem. Like they always fuck up your orders and they get substitutions that I didn't ask for. And yeah, like shit like that, like fair enough. I mean, it is possible to get around the issue of car ownership with grocery buying. Like you can take a big trolley with you, like one of those carts. I don't know what they're called. You know those carts you sometimes see people in cities with, especially like old ladies, those things on wheels that they take their stuff home with. Or you could use ride share. You could use taxi. If you're strong enough, you can just carry the damn bags, which is what I used to do. I'd take them on the bus and then carry them home from the bus stop. And it's like, yeah, if you're young and strong, you can do that, but not everybody has that option. I mean, and it is a good workout too. That's another thing. It's a really good workout. Um, but yeah, fair enough. Like there's I'll say there are certain inconveniences to not owning a car. Also, it's like, what if you do want to go away for the weekend to some like national park or whatever, or some wilderness area? It's like fair enough. You could always rent a car in those cases, but it's like, okay, what happens if you choose the one weekend when everybody wants to rent a car and there's no rental cars available? It's like, yeah, then you're fucked. I guess unless you reserve it well in advance. But again, it's like with weather, how can you fucking know, right? So fair enough. I will concede there are advantages and disadvantages to car ownership. But then there's the question of, okay, what if you own a car, but you live in an area that's not designed around cars? Then it's like that comes with its own specific pros and cons, because it's like you can own a car but not use it all the time and therefore avoid some of the pitfalls associated with car dependence. You'll be fitter, you'll get more walking in, you'll contribute less to the carbon emissions. On the flip side, though, there's still the pain in the ass and expenses associated with car ownership itself. So what I'm trying to say is being in that kind of situation can be the best of both worlds. It can also be the worst of both worlds. And you furthermore have to deal with like parking a car in an area that's not fully centered around cars. Like I've been in that situation before where I actually had to park the car on the street because the place where I lived didn't have its own parking spot, and I would have to parallel park, and I had a pass to parallel park within a certain area, within a certain neighborhood. And the problem was it would get so parked up that I'd be like driving around trying to find a spot. It was a big pain in the ass, I'll say that. But it's like, at the same time, it was partly my own fault because I was using the car more than I needed to for complicated reasons. But let's just say I was young and stupid at the time, and I didn't take advantage of the situation as I should have. I really should have been using transit a lot more then. But live and learn, right? I mean, it's partly how I became more urbanist in my thinking, is understanding the pitfalls of car dependence from firsthand experience. And keep in mind, I wasn't living this way for a terribly long time. It was only for a few months that I was in this situation. But yeah, I digress. I think I've gone over kind of like the pros and cons of each situation. So it really depends on ultimately what your life goals are and what you value more. Like some people value experiences, some people value things, some people value more space, some people value less space, some people value community, some people value family, or some people are more individualistic, some people are more collectivistic. I will agree with the basic premise that ultimately whether living in the city or suburbs gives you a higher quality of life depends mostly on what you want out of life, and also at what stage of life you're currently in. That being said, it's very tempting to just say live and let live. Like let the urbanites have their cities, let the suburbanites have their suburbs. Why can't we all get along? And that leads me to the next part of this video, which is why we can't all get along and why ultimately one will win at the expense of the other. It's kind of like neither can live while the other survives. Basically, the suburbs gain at the expense of the cities and the cities gain at the expense of the suburbs. And I'm going to be talking specifically about how suburbs hurt cities, but I'll also get into the other way around a little bit. So how suburbs hurt cities, why they can't simply coexist. Firstly, redirecting tax funding. And again, this goes both ways, but we see it in North American cities, specifically how a lot of tax funding is redirected toward automotive infrastructure like highways, roads, even the fucking Iraq war on behalf of big oil. Like we can debate all day about the cause of that war. I'm just saying, like, tax money goes toward car-centric funding, like for the gas stations, like the oil companies, all the car-centric infrastructure, at the expense of not going toward public transit and not going toward other things that specifically help urbanites, like public transit, but also like the maintenance of other city infrastructure. And Strong Towns goes into this quite a lot, how suburban infrastructure is way more expensive on a per capita basis, like per person, but also per land unit. It's way more expensive. So the fact is the suburbs siphon money from the cities. That is overwhelmingly what happens in North America. And politically, it's why it's political self-ownership. I'm not going to say the S word, the word associated with Harley Quinn, because apparently on YouTube, it's bad to say that word. Even the band S Tendencies, I can't search for that band without getting a bunch of like, oh, don't do it, don't do it, we're here to help you. Like, fuck off. I just want to listen to some crossover thrash. But like, anyway, yeah, it's political S word to not support the suburbs because suburbanites are such a big voting block and they go both ways. They swing both ways. They're bi-curious, bi-political, left and right. So like there's so much pandering to the suburbs and it results in tax money and resources being reallocated toward the suburbs. And that is usually the outcome in North America, that the suburbs win, the cities lose. Hypothetically, though, the opposite could also happen. Like the cities could win at the expense of the suburbs, which is kind of, I think, more in Europe the case. But again, that balance could shift in Europe, and it's starting to shift a little bit, which is a worrisome trend there. The suburbanization of Europe. But yeah, I mean, the redirecting of tax money, like money is a limited resource. There's only so much money to go around, and it's going to go one way or the other. So that's one reason why they simply can't coexist is tax dollars. Like one will gain funding, the other will lose funding. It's a constant tug of war. Next reason is the battle for productive people, the brain drain. A lot of cities in the past went to shit because the suburbs deliberately catered to the best and brightest. And there was a conscious movement to get the best and brightest into the suburbs and out of the cities. That was basically what happened under FDR, under the New Deal. They specifically financially incentivized wealthy, high-earning, productive people to move into the suburbs and out of the cities. They gave money to people for new homes and not for existing homes, specifically for single-family homes. It was a program that was specifically intended to brain drain the high-earning and productive people away from the inner cities and into the suburbs. Today, incentives work a little bit differently, and there's been some reverse brain drain back into the cities, but not fully. And I would argue there's plenty of suburbs, there's plenty of inner cities in the US that still kind of fit into the 1950s, 60s model, like, say, Baltimore, for instance, or New Orleans, where the suburbs are still wealthier on average, and the cities kind of suffer a lot still from ghettoization. So, like, there's obviously a racial element to this, but there's also a socioeconomic element, more broadly speaking. So there is that. There is that way that the suburbs gain at the expense of the cities is by turning the cities into ghettos, by deliberately incentivizing the wealthier, more productive people to live in the suburbs. It's kind of a bit of a Pandora's box, where it's like once you open that box, yes, a lot of the wealthy people will choose to live in the suburbs. So the wealthier, more productive, less crime committing people. So it's like there is kind of that Pandora's box element, that like tragedy of the commons element, where it's like once the suburbs exist, they will inherently, to some extent, sabotage the cities. But not only that, it will create a feedback loop where the government starts promoting policies that promote the suburbs at the expense of the cities. There's also that more directly, the suburbs will hurt the cities by demanding roads and parking within the inner cities. So literally destroying large parts of the city, including often beautiful historic buildings, for the sake of building parking lots, parking garages, and wide roads and freeways, which is exactly what happened to many of the inner cities of Canada in the US between the 50s and 70s. Entire inner cities were destroyed in some cases, like Hartford, Connecticut, or large sections of inner cities in the case of like Cincinnati, St. Louis, like a lot of the city, like Kansas City, a lot of these cities. Actually, Alexander Rotmans, he has a great series of videos on cities where this happened to the worst extent. Like Buffalo would be another example, Detroit, Albany. A lot of cities suffered from almost total destruction for the sake of catering to suburbanites. And they catered to suburbanites to such an extent that the suburbanites had no reason to go there anymore because the cities became hollow, empty shells of themselves to cater to suburbanites. Now, granted, this wasn't done to the same extent in every city, and it's no coincidence that the cities that today are considered the most beautiful and also the most economically productive, and that get the most tourists and that have the strongest draw, and the most historic architecture, the cities that are just the most dynamic and vibrant in this sense, including some of the more modern ones that didn't suffer from the same fate to this extent, like, say, Seattle or Portland. Yeah, it's no coincidence that the cities that weren't destroyed on behalf of suburbanites are the ones that are doing the best today overall. Like, the cities that weren't destroyed as much. I mean, every city in North America suffered somewhat. Even the cities that got off the most unscathed, like Quebec City or Charleston, South Carolina, still suffered a little bit. Or New Orleans or Savannah, that suffered the least from like so-called urban renewal, redevelopment, freeways, parking lots, parking garages, etc. Like even New York City, like even the ones that suffered the least still suffered a bit. No city was 100% unscathed in North America from this trend, but I'm saying the ones that suffered the most from it are basically ghost towns today, or at least kind of struggling, like, say, Detroit, Hartford, St. Louis, Buffalo. They're either really crime-ridden shitholes, or they're just kind of blah. They're not happening places. They're not interesting places. They're just kind of non-places. Like places like, say, like, Oklahoma City or what have you. So that's a big issue there. Another thing is, the reason why there's so many homeless in the inner cities is because the suburbs specifically refuse to have any homeless there. They refuse to take on their share of the burden, even though many of them vote for these policies. Like, many suburbanites are liberals. They vote for left-wing parties, but they just don't want this shit in their own backyard. They're NIMBYs. So they're massive hypocrites, many of these people, that they push these problems, the homeless problems, the crime problems, the drug addiction problems. They push these problems onto the cities, even though they want the policies that enable these problems, but they just don't want these policies in their own backyard. They're very hypocritical. Same with immigration. A lot of them want, like, the more undesirable immigrants. Like, they want these immigrants in their country, but they don't want them in their neighborhoods. And they want to push them entirely onto the inner cities. It's often very hypocritical. It's very shitty to just do this to the inner cities, and especially, and then they just make the cities worse by doing so. And they hurt themselves too if these people want to use the cities in any way, shape, or form, by just turning the inner cities into shitholes. So, like, I would say, if you have to have the ghetto somewhere, don't have it in the inner city. Have it in, like, some random part of the suburbs. Like, say, like, for instance, I don't know, like, say, East St. Louis or whatever, or Gary, Indiana. Have it somewhere off to the side. Don't have it in the inner city, because the inner city is supposed to be where everything happens. It's supposed to be where the museums are, where the historic architecture is, the center of the urban area. And it's like, it boggles my mind why, if you have to shove the undesirables somewhere, why you would choose the central urban city, especially in the cases of historic cities. It makes no sense. Like, if you have to shove them somewhere, why not shove them off to the side? You know, put them in Gary, put them in, like, Prince George's County, put them in, off to the side. Like, that makes more sense. And I'm not even saying that in this model, the rich suburbs can't also exist to some extent. I'm just saying, why put all the undesirables in the inner city? And it's not just because the inner city residents want it. That's a myth. Some of them do want it. A lot of them do want it, but it's also because NIMBY suburbanites push these undesirables into the inner cities. It is a mix of both factors, and it's ridiculous to deny that this is happening. Like, they will bitch and moan the second like a few homeless people end up in the suburbs, they will bitch and moan endlessly, even if they're the kind of people who voted for policies like safe injection clinics, which encourage this type of behavior. They want the safe injection clinics to exist. They just don't want them to exist in their own neighborhood. It's very hypocritical. And yeah, so there's that. Um, Refusing any new development. So, say for instance, they refuse condos. They refuse any new development in their areas, any new densification. The suburbanites often do this, and it results in historic buildings being destroyed in the inner cities to build these condos and other forms of higher density or whatever. And that's another way that suburbanites hurt the inner cities, by being such NIMBYs that they won't allow anything new to be built in the suburbs, especially anything that increases the density level at all. So, yeah, that's another obvious way. It results in overcrowding in the cities. It results in historic buildings being destroyed. It results in the roads and public transit in the cities becoming more overcrowded due to the overpopulation. And in some ways, it makes the cities feel more soulless, because you have all these condos going up everywhere, these ugly glass condos just destroying the soul of the city and making it overcrowded, because the suburbanites refuse to have any such thing in their own neighborhoods. And these problems exist across North America. We see it a lot in Toronto specifically, San Francisco, Montreal, cities that are undergoing large population growth, but where there is still significant NIMBYism in the suburbs, and especially in certain specific suburbs. Like, certain specific suburbs tend to be far more NIMBY than others. So that is also an issue. And the ones that are the most NIMBY are always the most low density suburbs. They're always the most like sprawled, low density suburbs. They're not always super white though, not anymore. A lot of these suburbs aren't as white as they used to be, but they're still very NIMBY. A lot of the outer suburbs of Toronto, for instance, are like this, where it's like they're not super white like they used to be, but they're still very NIMBY. Like, significant portions of, say, like Burlington, Oakville, Newmarket, Aurora, Richmond Hill, like a lot of these outer ring suburbs would be like this, and also some even like further outer ring exurbs that are still fairly white, like say Waterdown, Georgetown, Bradford, places like that. And also like Whitchurch, Stouffville, which isn't quite as white anymore, or Milton. Places like that, they're often the most NIMBY, and they often, they're the most NIMBYist, and they're not always super white, but they're always super NIMBY. So yeah. The next is like bringing vehicles into the city core. Like, they demand, well, I sort of talked about this already with like building the car infrastructure, but it's also just the cars themselves. Like, they take up so much space, and they present a danger to pedestrians in the city, like especially these like oversized vehicles like pickup trucks and Hummers and shit like that. And it's just, they don't belong in inner cities. It's trying to fit something huge into a space that is too small for it. It's not a good idea. And it creates congestion, it creates annoyance, and in the worst cases, it creates injuries and death. So there's that. I would say that's one of the most, like, on an individual level, that's one of the worst things that suburbanites do in cities, is bring their oversized vehicles into the dense urban areas. It is such a pain in the ass, and I've seen it repeatedly where they like scraping against the sides of walls because they can't even fit in these streets. Like, I've seen that in Europe with the SUVs in the historic old towns. And it's ridiculous. It's like you're damaging these buildings with your massive SUVs, in many cases historic buildings, with your massive fucking vehicles that were not designed for neighborhoods like this. And I see it in North America too. Like, I've seen it in the historic old towns in North America also, and it's ridiculous. Like, get those things out of the fucking dense cities, seriously. Ideally, get them out of everywhere, but especially out of the dense cities. Um, the next is the suburbs through their NIMBYism. I find they create a sense of political polarization that contributes to the climate of wokeness in cities, because I think a lot of people in cities, they vote left because the right panders so much to the suburbanites, and it creates a cycle of polarization that makes wokeness in the cities actually worse. And I mean, yeah, I do think in some cases you can blame the left for pushing the right further to the right, and you can blame the right for pushing the left further to the left. Like, I think there is an element of that. And I think you can blame the more extreme elements of suburban NIMBYism for pushing urbanites in the opposite direction and making them more woke. Because it's true that, like, if you want your public transit to get built, you basically have to vote for the left wing parties, and you basically have to support the most fucking leftist candidates possible. Because that's the only way your transit's going to get fucking built in this day and age. And I hate to say it, but it's true. And I don't vote for the left candidates because I'm not a one issue voter. And overall, I think the leftists are worse. But I will say the right pisses me off in that regard. And I can understand why urbanites feel compelled to support these far left parties, far left candidates, whatever, because they're the only ones often who will who will actually build the fucking transit. And yeah, I think the right has become so anti-transit, so anti-walkability, so anti-urban that, like, I completely understand why people, even people who have similar views to mine, feel tempted, or in some case even do vote for the left-wing parties. I get it. I don't vote for them personally, but I kind of get it. Because again, I weigh issues differently. I think the way I weigh issues overall, I think the left is worse. But I'd be lying if I said I haven't been tempted sometimes, like, because the right is so fucking bad on this particular issue. So, and there's no attempt at being bipartisan. It's just straight up like, fuck your cities, fuck your transit, fuck your walkability. Like, in most cases. I mean, I guess Doug Ford has done a little bit because he's building the Ontario line, which is very sorely needed. That's a new subway line in Toronto. But at the same time, he's half-assing the Eglinton line, which really should be a subway, not an LRT, and it's taking forever regardless. And redirecting money to this pie-in-the-sky Highway 413, which is a highway that's blatantly for suburbanites and probably for the mafia too. Yeah, do some research on that. You'll see what I mean. And also he's removing bike lanes in Toronto, which is just pissing a lot of people off. And it was not something that the local residents even want. The people who want this are the suburbanites who use these streets to commute. They're not the locals in these neighborhoods. So again, even with the case of Doug Ford, even if he throws urbanites a few bones here and there, overall, he seems to be promoting much more of a suburbanite agenda, a car-centric agenda. And hell, Doug Ford probably isn't as bad on this issue as, like, Trump, for instance, who seems to be like 100% pro-car, anti-transit. So yeah, I mean, it kind of sucks. It kind of sucks forcing people to make these choices. And I do blame the aggressive suburbanism, aggressive anti-urbanism of the suburbanist part of the right for this. Like, I think they keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And yeah, there's going to be pushback, and who can blame people for that? So yeah, I mean, those are the reasons why we can't simply all get along. And ultimately, I do think to some extent one side will triumph over the other. And as with everything, yeah, we can't just get along. We can't just coexist. Ultimately, you're going to have a society that's more catered toward urbanists or more catered towards suburbanists, more catered toward urbanites or more catered towards suburbanites. It's going to be one way or the other. One wins at the expense of the other. Neither can live while the other survives. So that's kind of the situation here. And yeah, I hope I drew some light onto this issue and why I feel the way I do.